Do you know the song from the Broadway show Cabaret that goes, money makes the world go around, the world go around, the world go around, money makes the... No one's even looking like they've ever heard this. All right, never mind, but still, I'm sure you've heard the sentiment that money makes the world go around, and it's not wrong. Lately, I've been noticing more money talk than for a long time. Across the political landscape in our country, attention has turned to tariffs and trade wars and the economic implications to industry and to jobs and to pensions and even sovereignty. Much has been made of the way that the new president of the United States values those who have the money and those who were invited to be part of the inauguration ceremony in January, for example. Now, individually for us, tax season has begun. People are gathering their receipts, getting their paperwork together. And certainly, we all notice that how much money available to us determines the way we make our choices about winter holidays or a coffee from Tim's, or where and how we purchase our groceries. We are acutely aware of how much money matters to the way we live. So increasingly, maybe always, but I think increasingly, money has a lot of power. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. What does that have to do with Jesus and his fishing story? What indeed? Let's back up. So the story we heard this morning takes place by the Sea of Gennesaret, a place that has been called by many different names throughout its history, usually depending on the dominant settlement on its shores. So if you thought that renaming places was a recent development, think again. This is the same body of water that we've referred to as the Sea of Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee, same sea. And Jesus is there. He's been teaching, people have been following him, and he notices that there are some empty boats on the shore. And the fishermen who use those boats have come in off the water and they are washing their nets. So he borrows one of the empty boats, pushes it out a little bit from the shore so that instead of being hemmed on from every side by the people, he has a bit of space so people can actually see him and he can actually see them. And so Jesus, we don't know exactly what, but he teaches for a while, tells them stories, and then says to the ones who've been washing their nets, you go and put your nets out in that deep water and see what you can catch. Did he think that the crowd was getting hungry and would be looking for lunch? Was he hoping to create a parable? The story doesn't tell us at all. But it does tell us that the fishermen who have just finished washing their nets aren't really keen on the idea. They had already spent all night on the water, catching nothing. And now this rabbi seems to think he knows something about where the fish are swimming that they don't. Never mind that they have spent their lives on this lake. Never mind that they're a little bit tired and they're discouraged. And Simon, to give him credit really, doesn't say no. He says, well, don't expect much because we've already done this, but since you asked, we'll go out. So they go out, and what do you know? Not only do they catch fish, they catch more fish than their nets can hold. Well, isn't that a shift in expectations? Can you imagine being one of those people who has spent all night fishing and getting nothing, and then suddenly more than you can imagine by trying a different place, a different time, one that really shouldn't work at all? There are lots of lessons in this part of the story all by itself, I think. It is an incredible story of hope for anybody who is living a long, dark night of the soul, convinced that they have tried everything and that there is nothing left. And maybe that's what you need today as you are listening to this story. Perhaps you don't know what is still possible. And perhaps it is still possible to shift expectations about what your life can look like. But indeed, there is a whole lesson in the value of being able to shift our perspectives, no matter whether your life is going great or terribly. I sometimes wonder if it does take something dramatic, like what happens in this story, to change the way we look at things. I'm probably never going to want to change the way I tie my shoes unless somebody makes me. We're blessed with something that the psychologists like to call confirmation bias or fixation, which simply means that we're tempted to look for evidence or reasons that confirms what we already want to think. So we look for proof, and then we trust the proof that confirms what we already thought. But we really don't trust the proof that would give us a different answer. Which means that if you don't think that's true, you're probably not going to believe anything I might tell you to convince you that it is. And yet, I suppose we know of or can imagine situations or people who get trapped by what they think they know, which prevents them from learning or trying something new. People who won't be convinced from their positions, no matter what evidence might be placed in front of them. Maybe you're one of those people. Perhaps we all have been at times. Maybe you're one of those people who thinks you'd be really good at something even though you've never tried it. There's this book called The Filter Bubble, What the Internet is Hiding from You, that uses an example of internet searches during the time of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil rig spill in 2010 to illustrate how our technology is actually encouraging us to do this. So the author of this book asked two of his friends to search up the company name BP. That's it. They were both educated white women from northeastern United States. They had the same or similar political affiliations. So every other way, they were pretty much similar. But based on their past internet searches, the things that they had looked up before, their search results of BP were vastly different. One of them was given all kinds of investment information about the company and all these promotional ads. And the other one saw all the news links about the oil spill. And so unbeknownst to them, the internet and the search engines that they were using were creating a bias based on the things they had already looked at and deciding what would be important information for them to know. And today, we see that this has expanded to such an extent that people are getting completely different versions of the news, depending on what news programs they watch, what internet sites they visit, whose social media feeds they follow, mostly containing evidence that supports what they already generally believed. Which then means that we have people moving through life with completely different understandings of life and what is actually happening in the world. We see this kind of tendency impacting other parts of life too. In business, when people act on what they assume is the right answer, what they assume to be true, rather than digging deeper to what might be true. We hear about this in medical diagnosis circles, that sometimes the diagnosis can miss the mark because of an assumption or a belief. This is the critique that's been offered for those things that are sometimes simply dismissed by some practitioners as, oh, that's just old age, right? Or, oh, that's just menopause, don't worry about it. If you know any magicians, they can tell you that they use this concept of fixation or confirmation bias when they perform tricks. so that people think that they are making free choices, but the magician knows they're not. And so I am a bit fascinated then by Luke's version of this fishing story that is slightly different from John's similar one in the Bible. In this one, Jesus makes sure to tell Simon to go deep. In John, Jesus says, try the other side of the boat, because they're already in the water. It's a similar message about challenging expectations, I think. But in this case, Luke makes sure that Jesus says, go deep. And going deep is not something we do a lot of these days, at least not in a healthy way. I'm not thinking Jesus is talking about encouraging us to dive deeper into our fixations or our obsessions that keep us already entrenched. But in general, we don't have time to go deep. We don't have time to investigate much beyond the headlines, the rumor mill, or the clickbait that draws our attention. It's just too much information. It's overwhelming. You can't keep track of it. And yet, Jesus is not wrong. Going deeper is probably the only way we are going to discover truth. In this world, that takes time and patience and a willingness to look beyond the surface. So that brings me back to where I started. Are you following me? Not quite? Well, here's how. Here's what I think. The people who followed Jesus might have been following him, assuming that he knew where the money was. After all, that's what fish represented for the people in this story, right? It was their livelihood. Fish meant money. Heck, for fisher people today, fish still means money. And they too lived in a world where those who had the most resources made the rules, and those who didn't have resources didn't make the rules. Even then, money seemed to make the world go round. And so you can imagine that for many people, the point of telling this story would be to talk about the magic fish producer from Nazareth. Today we might say the guy had a license to print money. And even today, you will find people who will continue to tell stories like this as proof that Jesus will make you rich. But that's where Luke, I think, would say, okay, were you not listening to the story? The fish is not really the point. Jesus says as much at the end of the story. He says, okay, now that I have your attention, the money, the fish, that's not where it's at. They're not an end in themselves. Let's take your energy, your time, your fishing skills, even your fish, and let's direct them where they matter. Let's use them for people. For people. Now, who's with me, he says. It's a pretty big shift in perspective. To look beyond our individual goals, to think about how we can use resources for the lives and the benefit of people, for the public good. But I do think that's a bit of what Jesus is trying to get at. So what of us then? As you come to this story of Jesus, are you looking for a magic fish provider? Are you looking for a teacher who will confirm what you already think? Or are you willing to go a little deeper, to see what else there is to learn, to be pushed a little bit, to discern how your resources and your strengths can be used for good? Jesus told the disciples that they already had gifts he could use. They didn't have to be anyone else. They didn't have to do anything differently. They could stay fishermen and be that, do that, but do it for people. So what about you? Do you know what gifts you have that God could use? If you're having trouble with that, think about the last time you lost track of time. What were you doing? Think of the last time you instinctively volunteered for something, or that you felt completely involved in what you were doing. Can you remember a time when someone had to tear you away from what you were up to? Because you were what? When you were the only person who noticed something, perhaps, or you surprised yourself by how well you did. Questions like these could point you in a direction. I've heard it said that most people already know what they need to do. They just need the courage to actually do it. So, if, despite its power and its influence and how much we need it and use it, money is not what really makes the world go around, if it's not just about the fish, how can we be involved in what truly does matter? That is the question. Jesus said, "Now, who's with me?" Who indeed? Amen.